This is the SmallRig cage for the Panasonic Lumix GH7 and GH6 and it has the model number 4824. So I created a review and I compared multiple different camera cages for the GH6 previously. I haven't purchased this camera cage, but I think since I've compared those, I have a good idea of what was wrong with them and what needed to be changed. So SmallRig has made some improvements to the camera cage. So this new cage has less holes here on the top. So once you attach one item on top of the camera cage, there's no more room for any other item. So there was no point of having those extra holes in the Black Mamba cage previously. So they've removed or they've reduced the number of holes here. So you still have the 3/8" 16 with the two locator holes, and you also have 2 1/4" 20. So that's enough. And on the right hand side, previously the Black Mamba cage would go around here and there wasn't any attachment points there. So they've changed that and they reverted back to the original design of their camera cage, which has 3 1/4" 20 threads here. And the advantage of this is that, for example, if you attach something like a microphone on this side, sometimes it conflicts with the ability to attach a screen here on the top of the camera. So instead, if you can shift the screen a little bit to the right and attach it here, that makes all the difference. So two improvements there. One on the top, they've reduced the number of holes there, which obviously increases the stability of the cage because the Black Mamba cage was a little bit soft, it would bend. So this improves the structural integrity of the cage. And also the fact that the cage goes across straight will make the cage to be more solid and have less flex in it. And the addition of these 3 threaded holes is also welcome because you can attach something there. Another improvement which is worth mentioning, and let me scroll down to a nicer picture of where this is shown, is this. So in order to keep the camera from rotating inside the camera cage, you have the option to screw the eyelet of the camera into the cage. And now the option exists on both sides. So both on the right of the camera and the left of the camera, in addition to the bottom screw. So you have 3 points of contact. On the previous cage from SmallRig, which was the Black Mamba cage, you could only screw in one side of the camera plus the bottom screw. So what would happen is the camera cage would come loose because the camera would move inside the cage and gradually the screws would become loose. So within one day, I would have to tighten it again. Whereas I think this will address that problem to a certain extent or improve it anyway, since you have 2 screws on both sides. That should stop the camera from rotating inside the cage. So those are 3 big improvements that I can see they've done to the cage. And they've changed some stuff here as well. So they've added their proprietary system for locking things. And this is still an Arco Swiss compatible side. And they've made it a little bit pointy so that it's easier to attach items from the bottom and then slide them up. I'm not too keen on proprietary systems for locking, and I think there's multiple ones that all different manufacturers have created. But unless they have something without patents that everyone can use openly, I think locking yourself into one of those proprietary systems creates more problems than it actually resolves. So a few things which they haven't fixed are, one is the HDMI and USB clamp. So this thing is not really functional. It doesn't do the job that it needs to do. You can essentially lock the cables from moving left and right, but they can still be yanked downwards. And I think that's a problem. So what needs to be done is for them to attach a structure in an N-shape type of design where it can screw onto this side of the cage and then go over the flaps of the camera and come here and then have this as well. So that way you should be able to lock it both from left and right as well as underneath it. Obviously, it takes a bit of design work to get something like that done, but it's definitely worth it because that's a big problem for HDMI cables getting yanked when you're doing live production. Another thing which they haven't improved on is this bottom part of the camera cage. So the GH6 and the GH7, they have an anti-rotation hole. So you could have a pin here which would be placed in there and that would also stop the camera from rotating inside the camera cage. So that's something that exists on the tilter cage. I don't think that's as much of an issue now that they've added screws on both sides of the camera eyelet because then the camera shouldn't move anyway, but just something to keep in mind that this is something they haven't improved. And one thing which they've made worse is that they've added these eyelets to the actual camera cage. So these eyelets exist on the Panasonic Lumix cameras, and I think they're awkward for the camera, but the one use that they do have, and it is very useful, is when you combine that camera with a camera cage that has 2 M2.5 screws that you can tighten in. So essentially the camera will sit tight onto the cage. then those two eyelets on the camera become really useful. But apart from that, if you don't want to use a cage, those two eyelets are a nuisance. So if you look at old Olympus cameras or Canon cameras, what they have is something which is in line with the camera body so it doesn't stick out, whereas on Panasonic cameras it sticks out, so it will take more space in your bag just because of those two protrusions. So this is something they've added to the SmallRig cage. The one thing which I'm not 100% sure about, but it looks like these can be taken off on the SmallRig cage. So if that's the case, then that's obviously a good thing because then you can take these things off. So it looks like there's a screw on top here which you can loosen and then pull this out. But I'm not 100% sure about this. So here you can see what it looks like is that there's a screw which can be unscrewed and then you would get rid of the eyelet. And this is the manual for the camera cage. And it weighs about 200 grams, so that's a relatively modest weight for these type of camera cages. In fact, let me see how much the Black Mamba cage weighed. Okay, so the Black Mamba cage was marginally lighter than this camera cage, but maybe just 10 grams at most. So that one I think was around 180 grams, whereas this one is 192 grams. So I think in the context, I think 10 grams is insignificant. And also this camera cage seems to be a better camera cage, so it's definitely worth it. So another improvement which they missed out on when updating the design of the camera cage is adding a metal part here. So this is the Condor Blue cage. This is not a good cage because it seems to be in multiple pieces and you have to screw it together. So that sounds like something that would come loose quite quickly and easily. So I prefer the SmallRig cage. But the one thing which is nice about this cage is that it has this metal section here. And what that does is that it keeps the camera cage to be more solid and have more structural integrity. And obviously, if that could be made in one piece with the rest of the cage, that would be even better. So in terms of improving the camera cage for the GH6 and GH7, I would say they would need to fix this part here for the HDMI and USB cables to also cater for the cables being yanked downwards. So if you have something like a U-shaped type of structure and something that goes across underneath the cables, then that would allow protection of the cables from being yanked downwards. And you could still have this type of design where it pushes against the cables both on the left and right to protect it from being yanked in the left and right direction. But I think cables being yanked downwards, that's the most common thing that happens when you have cables running from the camera to other equipment such as a switcher or encoder or something like that. So that's one thing that needs to be improved. The second improvement is that they need to add a pin here for the GH6 and GH7 cages to make sure the camera is less likely to rotate. And the third improvement they can do is on top of the camera cage, instead of having these threaded holes, to have a NATO rail. And what that does is essentially lets you add a top handle or remove it quite easily. And it doesn't need to be a top handle, it could be anything. So any NATO rail compatible attachment could be attached quite easily and taken off. So I think that's an easier method than having to screw things on. And I think it's also safer in the sense that once something has been attached to a NATO rail and tightened, it's less likely to come off easily. And the other thing is with the NATO rail, the force is going upwards. So if the NATO rail becomes a little bit loose, it's still not going to drop the camera. Whereas with the threaded holes on top of the camera cage, if the threads are destroyed, then obviously what happens is the camera can just fall down. So that's a more risky aspect than having a NATO rail. And the fourth improvement that they can do is to obviously have a metal section going from this part of the camera cage, the top right, and avoid the lens mount and then connect to the bottom of the camera cage here. That would give it a lot of structural integrity, particularly if they can keep the whole thing as just one piece. So if this additional metal part is not an addition that you need to screw on. So everything should just be one piece with the camera cages. And I think that would make it the perfect camera cage. But nevertheless, this camera cage is still a good improvement on the previous version of their camera cages. So they're improving, but the improvements are quite slow.